as secular people, we need to be very intentional about not repeating oppressive patterns. Historically, since the beginning of time, since religion existed, there has been this sort of practice of missionary work or using religious doctrine as reason to go into communities and, civilize people. However, often I notice and I see in humanist communities and secular communities this ego that we have about being right.
Hello everyone, it's Wednesday, March 7th, 2018, and this is your host, Taylor Carr. You're listening to the Armchair Atheism Podcast, the official podcast of GodlessHaven.com. You can follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/godlesshaven and on Twitter with the handle GodlessHaven. This show is also on iTunes, so please drop by there and give us a rating or review if you can to help spread the word about the show. For this episode, I talk with Rajani Gudla-Valeti about secular humanism and savior complexes. Rajani is a community organizer, consultant, and writer. For over a decade, she has worked at the intersections of social justice, public health, and the legal system. Rajani has conducted this work through the Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, Baltimore City Health Department, and Open Society Foundations. Currently, her primary passion is as community organizer for Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition, coordinating Bridges, Baltimore's grassroots movement for safer consumption spaces. In 2011, Rajani received her master's in public policy from Hopkins, focusing on gender-specific and racially equitable approaches to criminalized issues such as drug use and sex work. Rajani is also a trainer with Baltimore Racial Justice Action, co-organizer of Baltimore Asian Resistance and Solidarity, and board member of Foundation Beyond Belief. Unfortunately, there are a couple of spots during the interview where the audio cuts out, seemingly for connection problems or whatever, but they are very brief, just a few seconds it seems like, and having listened back to the audio, it doesn't seem like anything big or important is missing from those sections, so you should hopefully be able to follow from the context and everything. But I did want to mention that just as a heads up. With that said, I hope you enjoy the interview. Rajani, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So can you start off by telling us a little bit about yourself and some of your background, specifically sort of how you came into secularism and atheism?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a board member of Foundation Beyond Belief, which is a humanist charity that promotes secular volunteering and responsible charitable giving. I joined that board 2 years ago. In 2016, I had attended the Secular Social Justice Conference at Rice University in Houston in January 2016, and it was a really powerful experience for me. It was the very first time that I had ever been around. Not only was it my first secular conference in my life, but it was also the first time that I had been around majority peoples of color, other fellow peoples of color who identify as secular, atheist, humanist, etc. And so it was the very first time I had experienced that, and it was just so it's hard for me to even find words for that experience. It was so amazing. And so when I was there, and my brother actually came out, I live in Baltimore, Maryland, but I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area. My brother and our parents still live in the Bay Area. And so my brother Ravi came out to Houston with me. And so having that experience with him was just really great. And so when I was there, I had met Noel George, who is the executive director of Foundation Beyond Belief, and they were looking for board members. So I thought, I'm kind of one of those people where when I get excited about something, I just sort of jump completely into it. And so I went from being just this newbie in the secular world to a board member of a really great organization. And I was drawn to Foundation Beyond Belief because it really kind of sets up these humanist values that mean something for me around action and social justice. Also, just to say, just kind of who I am outside of that, and as part of that, professionally, I am a community organizer here in Baltimore. I specifically work with the Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition, and I also do, that's a part-time project, but it feels like, a lot of my life. I'm also a consultant. I work with Baltimore Racial Justice Action as a consultant, doing racial equity workshops and trainings with organizations. I'm also have a background in kind of public health and policy, so I do some evaluation programming sometimes. And I think since I've been kind of out there in the secular world and doing kind of different other projects, I've been doing more speaking and freelance writing on a variety of topics that are really exciting. So I do a lot. And then just also to say personally, so I'm Asian Indian, American, woman, atheist, humanist, queer, and second generation. So I'm the first of my family born in the United States. My parents and my older brother had immigrated from South India. My brother was 6 months old when they moved, and they had immigrated from South India to the United States. And so my parents, just kind of background on religious practice and all that jazz. My parents were arranged under a Hindu cultural practice. Arranged marriage as part of that. And so they were arranged. They moved out here. We were the first of my whole family to live outside of India. And so they had each other and me and my brother. My mom is devoutly religious Hindu. She still practices Hinduism. My father and brother have kind of named agnosticism, atheism, science, values. And so I grew up with my brother's like 6 years older than me, so he also kind of helped raise me. So all three of them gave me all these different sort of perspectives on value systems and were really open to just like whatever you're working with, right? Nobody was telling me you have to do this or you have to believe in that. So it gave me a lot of freedom. And they also really taught me to work to find balance between my cultural heritage, which is very intertwined with Hinduism, as well as my secular beliefs, And so I may have known that I was an atheist since forever, but Hinduism still kind of has, for better or for worse, some influences, I think, on how I see the world. So that is my whole story there.
No, that's really cool.
It's a lot.
Yeah, it sounds like you're very active too. So what motivated you to become involved in these sorts of political and social issues, including, it seems like, the fight for racial justice is something that you focus on a lot too?
Yeah. I wanted to give that whole full breadth of story with my family and everybody, because I think that is it, right? It is my identity. It is my family. My parents and my brother, and I've come to learn a lot of people in my family, extended family, are rabble rousers, right? Like, we do not accept injustice. My grandfather on my father's side was a journalist who wrote about the British imperialism and was often, challenged by those in power in India during imperialism. In India, British imperialism, which ended in 1947. And so my grandfather was really big in using his journalism to fight that. And so I think I have that in my blood. Like I said, both my parents and my brother, everybody really fights for what we believe in and fights for our freedom to exist, right? Like, sometimes it feels like my existence is my resistance. I'm dark-skinned, Indian American woman, not really following these stereotypes, and often having to experience a lot of racism and other forms of oppression throughout my life. It kind of pushed me into it. I don't know how to not do this work. So that's kind of how I continue to motivate myself in it.
Right. Well, before we get into the specifics then, maybe we can talk a little bit about what secular humanism is for those who may be less familiar with it. I'm willing to bet most of my audience probably has some general idea of it, but I think one of the things that also is often overlooked in this is the way in which secular humanism does relate to things like ethics and social awareness, for example.
Yeah, definitely. And, I feel like, well, for me, I know that there are some standard definitions of humanism, right? Those exist. But I also think that it's really important to figure out what it means to us as individuals, right? So Yeah, for me, definitely, it's a philosophy that embraces ethics, reason, and social responsibility. I think the social responsibility is really important to me because, it requires us to, for one, if you don't believe in a higher power and you don't believe that a higher power is going to come and save you or fix problems or even be reliable, right? Like if I know that if I try to pray right now, nothing's going to happen, for me personally, that it could really cause a lot of loss. Like, what do I do? It makes me feel like I never tried to pray. I'll put that out there. I don't think I ever tried to pray my whole life. And I think that's because I didn't feel like it was tangible, right? It didn't feel like something would come of it. What has always felt like more tangible is this idea that we only have this life and we are responsible for each other. And by we, I mean fellow human beings, right? So secular humanism to me is that social responsibility that, we only have this life, we only have each other, and that humanity is capable of providing for ourselves without an actual or belief in a God or a higher power. Also, I think, with humanism kind of separate from atheism, I felt atheism, like I've always sort of identified as an atheist, but it also felt like it was what I am not, right? The actual root of that word felt like, okay, I am not a theist. But humanism feels like I am striving towards improving kind of quality of life for all human beings because we are all that we've got, So that's what it is to me.
Sure. And it seems like, I'm sure we'll get more into this and touch on it too, but it seems like also there's kind of an older sort of atheism that is distinguishable from some of the new atheist stuff that's around there today, where also it was like part of your motivation as an atheist wasn't just, the intellectual arguments over the existence of God, but it was, hey, we need to realize that there's no help coming from above and stuff like that. We need to learn to be good to our fellow human beings. And so it's also this kind of mix of the two of those that, I don't know, maybe you feel the same way, but it feels to me like that often gets lost in the conversation a lot these days.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think it gets lost. And I know like I said, when I went to the conference 2 years ago, that was my first time entering the secular conference world and really getting into these communities. And so in the past couple years, I've come to learn very quickly how there are a lot of divisions, right? There's like, the whole, we need to be atheists and that is the term and we need to all use that term. And there is, the humanist folks, right? And it's almost like we're all different. And I've always gotten really confused by that because yeah. I'm totally with you, right? I'm like, but we all agree that there's no God. We all have that in common. And I feel like just the natural next step is we are all we have. So let's rely on each other and support each other. And I feel like that really does get lost. I think you said it pretty well.
It's interesting because I think some people would suggest, maybe not incorrectly, that currently our biggest problem as a country or globally is a general sense of apathy and selfishness. So one of the things that you've talked about that is going to be kind of the focus of this episode too is something called the savior complex. And so if there's such a problem already with apathy and selfishness, why should we be concerned with savior complexes too? I know it's a big question. Sorry.
It is, and it's a great question because I laugh mostly because it's like I can imagine folks being like, well, you don't want me to be this and you don't want me to be that, right?
Exactly.
Now I can't even try to say, I know, I'm so challenging. I think my thing is that we need to be very, very intentional as secular people. If we need to be very intentional about not repeating oppressive patterns. Religious communities and historically, since the beginning of time, since religion existed, there has been this sort of practice of missionary work, right? or using religious doctrine as reason to go into communities and, civilize people. Or even Christianity was even often used to support enslavement, right? And so, being a South Asian person and being specifically Indian, when I grew up, I still do. I get so infuriated by these ideas of like people going into India, like, oh, such a third world country. I'm going to go there, do my missionary project there and protect and save people, right? And so I think as secular people, very clearly recognize the problems of that. And we can say, oh yeah, that's problematic for one, because these are people with a religious doctrine going in and trying to convert people who might not come from that religious practice, right? And which has been very common. That's the biggest reason for missionary work, has been to spread the word of someone's God, and which is oppressive and sort of dismantles cultures and heritage. And so we know that that's wrong. As secular people, I'd hope many secular people recognize that that is wrong. However, often I notice and I see in humanist communities and secular communities this ego that we have about being right. Yeah, right? Like I know personally, I do know that there is no God. And at the same time, I don't necessarily feel that it is my only job is not to just convince everybody of this. And that's one thing. But also when we say, I'm doing this to help you, right? Like I am teaching you about my perspectives, even though I know it's true, right? Because I'm trying to help you. And other ways that I'll try to help you is maybe I'll come and we'll do different, we'll have educational services, or we'll do all these things that are service oriented with my perspective of I'm going to make sure that this person by the end of the day or by the end of this time knows that, I'm right and they need to change their perspectives. And I think that that can come from an inherently savior complex issue, because it feels to me that it is just repeating those oppressive patterns that a lot of historically a lot of religious groups have done. And so what we need to do is just kind of recognize our responsibility to acknowledge history, acknowledge the consequences of that kind of missionary style, and to think about, what would it look like to not necessarily try to save people, right? But to kind of acknowledge the power that people already have. And within humanism, I think that there is this, if we recognize that social responsibility is a tenet of humanism, then it is also our responsibility we also have a responsibility to our history as humans. And I think that's what's really important, is to just kind of acknowledge that we do not exist in isolation. We all come into this world with the history of disadvantages and advantages for different peoples, and we have to kind of work together to uproot that power dynamic and not just save other people. I hope that kind of makes some sense.
Yeah. We also hear a lot of talk, especially in the more social justice-oriented circles, about being an ally. And it sounds like from what you just said that one of the I guess problems, there's multiple problems with it, but one of the issues is that it's really condescending to talk about like saving somebody or have this kind of attitude towards them as if, all of the things that they've done in their lives, you're going to be the one that makes this big difference. It's kind of dismissive of all that they've been through and their history and their past. But I think there's also some criticism that seems to be leveled sometimes towards just the idea of people, self-describing as allies and stuff like that. So maybe it would be beneficial to talk about what are some of the differences that do distinguish someone from being I guess you could say, a real ally and someone who's trying to save the day, sort of.
Yeah, I think then I appreciate how you frame that too, around sort of putting this pressure on others around like saving. So I think that what distinguishes an ally from someone who's trying to save the day is really seeing the relationship and not the self. And what I mean by that is is to figure out, what is my motivation here, right? Like, I need to recognize that it's hard for me as a person of color to like tell, I'm not going to tell white people what to do. I'm saying white people because often in this case, when we are trying to acknowledge what history is and what social justice is, we're talking about racism, patriarchy, homophobia, all of these systems of oppression that are part of our heritage as human beings. And so what I find to be, when I think of who are the best allies, I think of people who show up, right? As in, showing up for Black lives, showing up for protests, showing up for demonstrations, showing up when I feel like, I need to be heard, right? As a woman of color. And so there's the showing up, and then there's the listening. And I think that's where the savior complex thing comes into play, where usually with a savior complex, there is this idea of I am right and I have this certain perspective that others need to understand and believe and carry on. And that is very different than listening, because listening is really hearing people's experiences and making sure that you're stepping back and centering, the ways that somebody might have been completely disenfranchised their whole life and maybe just want to be actually heard or even have their own ideas. And I think that's the other piece to it, is to know that there are solutions within communities. There are solutions within impoverished communities, within communities of color, that people have been trying to work to figure out how to get out of these oppressive systems for a long time. We don't have the resources to get out of it, honestly, often. And so a really great ally would be someone who would come to a space, listen to whatever ideas or solutions are coming out of that marginalized group or community, and say, okay, how can I help? What can I do? And instead of, here, I have a solution for you, or here are all of these suggestions and recommendations, instead of that, it's really about that listening and showing up. And also, honestly, I'm getting more into the, instead of ally, I'm getting more into the phrase accomplice, which I think is really maybe a little more resistance oriented, but just sort of like, if you're willing to be my accomplice, if you're really willing to put your body on the line for certain cases and make sure that I get heard and help to empower me, then I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, I like that. That really has a different and powerful connotation to it too.
Yeah, it does. It does.
So, to put you kind of on the spot, does humanism have a savior complex problem?
I think that humanism without historical context can have a savior complex problem. I think what the issue really is, and when we talk, I like to center ourselves in kind of U.S. society for a moment. U.S. society has a racism problem and a white supremacy problem and a patriarchy problem. Right? U.S. society, a lot of the work I do with Baltimore Racial Justice Action, we talk about how we in the United States are inculcated with white supremacist, racist messages. That it's in the air we breathe and the water we drink, all of us. People of color, white folks, everybody. And so we can often perpetuate these systems without even knowing it, without intention. It can happen. And so if we are in that system, if we are in that culture, then whatever other identities and belief structures we have are influenced by that. And so I think humanism is often influenced by that. So my example is, for me, when I talk about what humanism to me, requires me to not have a savior complex as somebody who has the privilege of having U.S. citizenship, as an example, right? And I need to acknowledge that my humanism is to make sure, because also for me, social justice is inherent to my humanism, that when I'm working to improve quality of life for all other human beings, then that means working with people who are undocumented or who do not have citizenship power, and to see how I can step back and support them, right? And so I need to acknowledge my own, like, for me, it's about kind of checking in to make sure I don't have a savior complex. But for others who are humanists, that might not be part of it. So I don't necessarily think that it's humanism that has the savior complex. I think that it's individuals and our society.
Right, and it's interesting to me because it feels like some of what maybe we're seeing as a pushback from some of the individuals within the atheist community or the secular community is partly because it seems like to me, the atheist community and the humanist and secular communities are communities just like any other community in the rest of our society. And so they're going to, like you said, they're going to have the same sorts of problems that we see in other communities. And I think some of the pushback now is from maybe certain people wanting to just say, well, no, that problem's not there because it's not there even in the broader society, which seems like, it's kind of just denying the evidence that should be right there in front of your eyes. But
right.
So what are some of the productive ways that we can encourage people from other communities to join into dialogue on social justice issues without us dominating the conversation or engaging in tokenism? I know that
when we say other communities, who are we talking about?
Well, just to take an example, I guess, if we're talking about bringing people of different gender communities into the fold more, or people from non-white communities, or I guess I kind of wanted to leave that a little bit broad and open because.
Yeah, but I just honestly wanted to be clear, and are we talking about people who are not humanist or
Sure.
not? But yeah,
that's a good point too. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what I would say is that, and this is one of those things that I'm realizing is harder than it sounds, but we need to accept that social justice is part of the humanist framework. It just is. I do not think that it is separate, or I honestly cannot even imagine what humanism is without social justice. And so when I hear so much pushback amongst people who identify as humanists, when I hear so much pushback to even the concept of talking about social justice, I get so confused and thrown off because I'm just over here like, then what are we doing? What are we even doing then? And so I think the first step, and it seems simple to some and hard to others, is to accept that social justice is part of the humanist framework. We also need to, or at least what I would encourage, the sort of white majority, let's say, of humanist members or humanists in the country, is to acknowledge history and how that impacts our identities and relationships today. So it's about sort of taking that journey, doing some reflection on what does it mean to be who I am with the identities that are in my body as I engage in work, and when and what it means to be a white humanist, what it means to be an Asian humanist, or a black humanist, right? And to really think about the ways that our identities interconnect with our humanness and our humanism. And so it's really a lifelong journey. I know I don't have the answers to that, but I do think that being willing to accept social justice as part of humanism and being willing to take that journey in anti-oppression work is really kind of the first step. And that will encourage more peoples of color and folks from marginalized communities to engage, I think. I mean, again, when I think back to what even got me to go to the Secular Social Justice Conference, if I had, let's say I was looking for, what had happened was, let me start here. I had learned about humanism in summer or fall of 2015 from my partner, actually, who was a white man. And he was telling me about humanism. He identifies as a humanist. And so I was like, I want to learn about this more. I want to kind of talk to other people because I'm a really relational person. I like to talk to others and learn about what these communities look like. And so I started Googling just humanism and humanist communities, like start there. And the first thing that happened to pop up because of timing was the Secular Social Justice Conference. And I came across the ad for it just in time. And show up. And I was drawn to the fact that it said in the description, panels will be predominantly people of color. This is geared towards marginalized voices, marginalized people, and by marginalized I mean people of color, people of various gender identities, and people who have been sort of pushed to the outskirts in our racist, white supremacist society. And so this Secular Social Justice Conference was very boldly promoting it as a place to center the voices of marginalized people. And so I knew that I would be comfortable and I knew that I would be welcomed. If I had done that Googling and the first thing I came across was pretty much any other national conference that is secular focused, and I saw predominantly white faces, or white voices, or in the speakers list, it was predominantly white people, I don't think I would have gone. And I don't think I would be here talking to you, right? Because I wouldn't have taken this journey in my humanism. And so it really is about creating those spaces to encourage us to engage. And by us, I mean, people of color and various voices.
Sure. So you are one of the speakers for this upcoming Secular Social Justice Conference in D.C. this year. So first, let me say congratulations.
And I know I'm plugging it so much that I guess
it's coming up pretty soon too, isn't it? What maybe you want to tell listeners a little bit about it and some of what's going to be going on there too.
Sure. So the Secular Social Justice Conference this year will be in D.C., I believe the first weekend in April. And it's a one-day event that is hosted by American Humanist Association. Sincere Carabo, who is the social justice coordinator for AHA, has really been putting such amazing work into it. I think he's doing such a fabulous job. And so the conference will be a one-day event to kind of hear a different variety of voices of humanists and secular folks who do work in or have great passion in social justice to talk about different topics, right? So I will be there speaking on my harm reduction work. So harm reduction is a set of philosophies that is focused on kind of meeting people where they're at in their life experience. So it's often focused on a way to create policies and practices to kind of reduce the consequences of drug use, homelessness, and sex work. But it also, harm reduction can be expanded to a lot of different issues. And so so I focus my work as a community organizer for harm reduction in Baltimore. A lot of my work is around how do we find alternatives to criminal justice approaches to drug use and sex work. And so I will be speaking about the war on drugs, which is a topic that I really love talking about because I think we in the United States tend to forget that the war on drugs is still going on, and that as long as drugs are criminalized, then human beings are criminalized, and that the war on drugs really has been rooted in racialized, racist policies that have targeted specifically Black people, brown folks, Asian folks in the United States. And so those policies still continue to today and has increased this kind of militarized policing structure. And so harm reduction gives us an opportunity to take these to take drug use and sex work and all of these human behaviors out of the criminal justice system and think about how can we support human beings and individuals in our communities without relying on incarceration. And so I will be talking about the war on drugs and also really bringing it to a perspective of, as humans, as humanists, we need to care about this and how harm reduction as a philosophy can really help us as humanists figure out how we can figure out what to do and kind of actions to take. So that is what I will be talking about.
Yeah, that sounds great. Do you happen to know if these are going to be, if these talks are going to be recorded or anything, maybe make their way online after the event, or?
I actually don't. I don't know.
Okay.
So that might be a question for Sincere. And sorry, I think
Sure.
my email kept blinging when I was talking. It was very distracting to me.
No, it's all right. It happens.
Okay. Yeah.
Well, aside from the conference, is there anything else you'd like to plug or mention, or where can people find more out about you and your work?
Yeah. Well, as far as my work and just knowing who your audience is, I definitely want to plug Foundation Beyond Belief. We are a small shop, but we provide a lot of support with programs and volunteer and charitable giving programs around the world, as well as in the United States. And so we definitely encourage folks to support, provide any financial donations. Any amount is welcome. So they can go to the Foundation Beyond Belief website to support us. As far as me, if folks are in the Baltimore or Maryland area, I do a lot of work in organizing and events with Baltimore Racial Justice Action and Baltimore Harm Reduction Coalition, which I would highly encourage people to kind of look into, and especially if you're curious about what those look like. And then I also I have a website that I'm trying to write a blog and have pieces up there, which I'm not that great at, but my website is charminglyhyphenated.com.
All right. Well, Rajani, thank you so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Taylor. I really appreciate chatting with you.
I'd like to thank Rajani for coming on the show. If you'd like to find out more about her or read any of her writing, links will be available in the description for this episode at godlesshaven.com. I'd also like to thank Sincere Carabo for recommending this episode's guest. At godlesshaven.com, you can find out more about the show, more about myself, and plenty of additional content. Music in the show is my own work. Thank you for listening, and please join me again in the not-too-distant future for another episode of Armchair Atheism.